Good morning. Thank you all for being here at 10 a.m. on a Friday. It's great to have an audience to speak to. One always worries having these things in the morning that won't always be the case. So this morning I'm just going to start with a very brief introduction, then I'll introduce Jonathan Massey, who will be the moderator for our panel this morning. And after this panel, we'll be breaking for lunch and then reconvening for the following two events. I've been teaching at Yale for about 16 years, and I've kind of noticed a trend in the School of Architecture that our architectural symposia typically revolve around a theme of death. We have the urgency of climate change, which implies death, catastrophe and consequence. We have to save corporate modernism before it dies. And we've had individual and epic symposia about dead people, all about the same scale as this symposia, mostly all Yale affiliated. Ones on Charles Moore, Eero Saarinen, Louis Kahn, Jim Sterling, Richard Kelly, Philip Johnson, Paul Rudolph, and Palladio, the only non-affiliated person in that group. In 2014, we had the symposium Is Drawing Dead? And then Carla Britton's wonderful symposium, Constructing the Ineffable, which of course is trying to figure out where you go after you die. This symposium, however, is a symposium of the living, not just people, but living discourses. So this symposium ties together a lot of different disciplines, but these disciplines, I would say, aren't always fully formed. In that sense, they don't always have correct answers or such firmly established positions. So it may be a little bit more of a speculative symposium than the symposia here at Yale tend to be, which is what this was invented to do. Today's emerging interest in reconsidering the aesthetic has started to permeate a number of fields ranging from philosophy to the arts, architecture, activism, curation, politics, ethics. And what I thought of when I was pulling this all together is that there seem to be these different continents of disciplines and discourses, but they're being unified by different ways of addressing an idea about the aesthetic that forms a kind of equator which begins to link them all. So it's interesting that people are coming at the aesthetic with very different perspectives, and I think we'll see that today and tomorrow, and with Elaine's talk last night, so there will probably be some conflict, but the hope is that we leave with some questions, and if they're at least not fully formed, they're a recalibrated set of speculations regarding the social, artistic, political, and ontological problems, somehow inherently or explicitly inlaid in the aesthetic. So with that, I'm going to introduce Jonathan Massey, who's generously agreed to host this, to moderate this panel. Jonathan Massey is the Dean of Architecture at the California College of the Arts and co-founder of the Aggregate Architectural History Collaborative, a collaborative that has not only single-handedly infused architectural history with a collective energy not seen for decades, but has literally reformatted how the very subject can be engaged for a new generation of scholars. Massey is a prolific and eloquent author, as seen in his book Crystalline Arabesque, Claude Bragdon, Ornament and Modern Architecture. Claude was an architect around Rochester who was in the vein of Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright, as well as Jonathan's numerous essays on the way architecture builds civil society, shapes social relationships, operates through financial regulations, and addresses issues of contemporary consumption. Massey was also the editor of Governing by Design, Architecture, Economy, and Politics in the 20th Century, making him uniquely well-suited to moderate this particular panel. Massey holds degrees from UCLA and Princeton, and has also taught at Syracuse University, where he was the Meredith Professor of Teaching Excellence, which is a great title to have for a chair, and the chair of the Bachelor of Architecture program. Please help me in welcoming Jonathan Massey as he moderates the session of the symposium, Aesthetics at Earth Magnitude, Capital, Property, and Ecology.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first session of today's symposium. Thanks to Mark, of course, for organizing and planning such an intellectually ambitious and I'm sure logistically taxing event. I'm quite excited to see what kind of conversations we can develop among the speakers and with you, the audience, in this first session. So, as you probably have already been thinking, climate change and globalization have gotten us talking a lot about scale. Conceptualizing the Anthropocene entails grappling with the very small to the very large. We talk a lot about molecules and parts per million, but also about hyperobjects massively distributed in time and space. And in between, we stop at bubbles, globes, foams, and many other figures for thinking time and space at a range of scales. And while many of us may be in the habit of thinking aesthetics at the scale of the painting, the person, the vase, or the building, to start the day, let's consider aesthetics at Earth magnitude, as Mark suggested. So we'll start by reflecting on the aesthetics of capital with Keller Easterling, an architect and writer well known here for her teaching, well, here and everywhere, for her teaching, her intellectual leadership, and her mastery of pataphysics. Since even before publication 17 years ago of Organization Space, Keller has anatomized the spatial products of capitalism, the legal, financial, and architectural protocols that produce much of our built environment. In Enduring Innocence, in Extra Statecraft, and in other writings, she's shown also how these instruments format politics at every scale. With this morning's paper, English, Keller puts a new spin on indeterminacy, dissensus, and the violence of bulletproof forms. Please join me in welcoming Keller Easterling.
Good morning. Oh, I have to do this. Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning. Can you hear me? Yeah. So, can we do the slides? I want to, yes, all the thank yous and everything, thank you. And thank you for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure to be here in this company. And I want to offer a very elementary contemplation about indeterminacy in aesthetic practices, the way in which some perhaps unlikely aesthetic practices have special capacities for form-making and political activism, capacities that might even be able to outwit stealthy political powers in very large global socio-technical organizations. And by large socio-technical organizations, I mean not only a hidden infrastructural layer of pipes and wires for communications or transportations or utilities, but also a surrounding medium of repeatable formulas for space, a far from hidden soup of logistics and standards and laws and spatial products that are overriding parts of the planet with contagious recipes for entire cities and regions. So not only buildings with shapes and outlines, but also the spatial matrix in which those buildings are suspended, something like multiple operating systems for shaping space. And as a dissonant accompaniment, I'll share a few tiny clips from the garden variety urban porn that promotes this matrix space, specifically free zone urbanism that relies on, after Xian some conflation of kawaii and kawaii, or the cute and the creepy. Architecture often regards engagement with this matrix as something to the side of the disciplinary tradition of form making, something like bureaucratic policy making involving vague ethical obligations rather than artistic choices. And it seems perfectly reasonable artistic choice to me to be interested only in well-rehearsed techniques of form making within the discipline, but I still have to confess to an additional artistic curiosity about the making of active forms that can manipulate a larger spatial matrix, a kind of form making for which not only my discipline, but a broader culture is probably under-rehearsed. We're good at pointing to things and calling their name, and not so good at seeing or manipulating the chemistry between things, the repertoires that they enact. So maybe in that way, this matrix space I'm talking about is productively imponderable. After Rosalind Williams, it's too big to be an ordinary object thing with a name. It exceeds or confounds routine modes of determination or intellection or form making or problem solving or even political dissent. It can't be assessed for its shape and outline, but maybe by its disposition, its propensities within a context, its potentials or affordances unfolding over time and territory. It's a matrix that makes some things possible and some things impossible, a growth medium that decides what will live or die. So to assess it or to manipulate it, it's almost as if one has to cultivate the equivalent of a kind of canine mind that perceives in split screen. You see things with names, just as you might hear the human speaking words, but it's hard to separate, even really comprehend those words or resolve those things in the absence of 1,000 other cues or potentials or relative positions between things in context. The position of the human relative to the door or the dog bowl, or their position or potential for kindness or anger is all being assessed equally with the sound of words and their assigned meanings. So it's all too obvious to say that assessing this disposition of matrix space expands the frame of aesthetic thinking beyond codified connoisseurship to be more inclusive of, after Rancière, the aesthetic practices that both depict and enact, that articulate, quote, ways of doing and making. And he writes, quote, at the heart of what I call the aesthetic regime of art is the loss of any determinate relationship between a work and its audience, between its sensible presence and an effect that will be its natural end. The powers of global governance that regard this matrix space to be just a byproduct of econometrics or informatics are asking for more declaration, consensus, rational hard-boiled policy or cast-iron economic science. Architecture culture also has a habit of looking for declarations and right answers. So it's counter to those expectations that we would argue not for consensus and determinacy, but for dissensus and indeterminacy, the very things in which we're under-rehearsed, as potentially more practical and more politically powerful. Sounds contradictory. So I want to talk about how to make the aesthetic practices of this dispositional indeterminate layer more palpable, and how to make the canine split screen more instrumental so that designers can work with form that manipulates not only activities and temporal dimensions of matrix space, but also its duplicities and temperaments. So although it might first seem like it has nothing to do with, in scale or content, with large technical organizations in matrix space, I want to contemplate ways in which even intimate aesthetic practices of performance, whether that of an actor or a comedian or a confidence man, can maybe provide insight in dealing with these leviathans of matrix space. So an actor has a line, "Come home, son," but that text carries less information than the action the actor chooses to play. They can play to smother, to dismiss, to plead, or even to reject. And so the words have some information, but the action is the primary carrier of information. And when the actor in dialogue replies, "I'll never come home," the first actor reacts to whether the action is to defy or to submit or any other action. And the actors can't really predetermine their response based on the text itself. The actors with sort of beautiful canine minds are quite practically up to their elbows in actions and infinitive expressions. It's their job to string together in a split screen a sequence of explicit, deliberately designed actions as well as spoken word. And philosopher Gilbert Ryle, it may seem like an odd, an unlikely interlocutor, used performance to theorize disposition. The comedy of the clown, he argued, is dispositional, unfolding, and reliant on an interplay with an audience. And the indeterminacy of that sequence doesn't make it magical or unknowable. It's just a different kind of knowledge. You can't have the right answer to being funny. As Ryle said, it's not the knowledge of knowing that, knowing the right answer, but the knowledge of quote, knowing how. Or take the confidence man who's hustling at pool. The hustler is reliant on how the sucker reacts as the hustler leads them down the garden path. And the game of pool is itself a network of sequenced relationships. It's played like a chain reaction with multiple branching possibilities that can't be predetermined because they change after every shot. So acting and being funny and hustling is something you can only know how to do. There's an artistic comfort with and pleasure and seduction in working through changing, unfinished processes for which there can only be dynamic markers. You can only know how to navigate a river or land a plane in high wind or sling plaster. You can only know how to kiss or tell a joke. So you don't know the right answer, but you know something about what to do next. And there have been others, Bent Mackay, Bruno Latour, others who've used performance to model interplay in large socio-technical organizations because manipulating changes in these vast organizations is maybe also something you can only know how to do. So, and matrix space is filled with things that have names and outlines. But the split screen of the canine mind, in that split screen, it's also filled with multipliers and repeatable components and switches and sequences with relative potentials. So designing in matrix space benefits from an artistic curiosity about reagents and spatial mixtures or wiring, about designing not only a single thing, but an updating platform for inflecting populations of things or setting up relative potentials within them. We can design a single building, but it extends our power, the power of that form to also be designing an active form, to design form positioned to disturb global networks with its relative potentials or timing or broadcast, or to design a multiplier that, like a germ, uses these organizations as a carrier. So a material, physical, deliberate, explicit design that takes an indeterminate path in space and time. It's time-released form. I mean, it's too obvious, but like the elevator was a multiplier that changed the crust of the Earth. So can you design a multiplier or a switch, a delta or an interplay? Or maybe it's less like designing a thing with shape and outline and more like having hands on the faders and toggles of space making. This kind of form making in another active register or gear perennially surfaces and is perennially suppressed within more dominant habits of mind that have more confidence in declarations built into language or law. Something like active forms have arguably been a chief preoccupation in both the sciences and the arts in the 20th century, fueling investigations in conceptual art, cybernetics, psychology, film, media, performance. But they're sometimes sidelined as daft, soft, inchoate, psychologized practices with little applicable substance, or not indeterminate enough, are attracted to the vortex of utopian prescription, holistic manifesto, or right answers. But in contemporary culture, from economists looking at a more complex context to oncologists looking at tissue as well as tumor, there are those who are looking to active, indeterminate strata to make sturdier speculations. So beyond the design of the totalizing is the design of the iterative. The right answer is doomed to be right only for an instant before its superiority is challenged, but an unfolding set of changes is more responsive. So indeterminacy isn't uncommitted, marginal, or weak. It only maybe has sufficient temporal dimension to respond to a counter move. So in addition to the design of master plans is the design of reagents or interdependencies, chemistries, chain reactions, ratchets. They don't offer a correct answer or a homeostatic balance, but specifications for linkage and interdependency that continually counterbalance and imbalance each other. This dispositional register of an organization is incredibly powerful, not only because it can extend into time, but also because this canine split screen, in this canine split screen, it can be discrepant from or decoupled from its declared intention. In the performance, the line, "Come home, son," can be played with the action to reject, an action that's completely at odds with the presumed meaning of the word. Irving Goffman and maybe another unlikely interlocutor used performance to theorize the presentation of self in everyday life, the way in which people are always saying something different from what they're doing. And he was fascinated with discrepant characters like confidence men who use their skill with the split screen to misalign their actions and their declarations. The socio-technical networks that we're looking at are made of a reciprocal interplay between humans and non-humans. They are in equal parts stories, words, declarations, and technologies, organizations, or potentials. And the stealthiest global powers or most successful global bullies, like confidence men, know how to manipulate the stories that attach to technologies and organizations. They're masters of the split screen who are saying something different from what they're doing. They know what lies are doing. They know how lies work. They know, for instance, that telling one lie is a bad idea, but telling many lies is wildly successful because it starts to kind of build up a Teflon coating on which rationality begins to slip and slide. So again, exceeding intellection and meaning, it's how the lie bounces that's important. So the birther rumor, the rumor that global warming is a hoax, they spread faster because they're more distant from fact, so easier to refute and so repeated twice as often. Or corporate management gurus know how to build up a welter of aphorisms and best practices to avoid political regulation about labor or environment. Or ISIS recruiters know how to mix GoPro footage of execution with puppy love and even floated on persuasions about girl power to attract teenagers to the caliphate. Or the shiny utopias and right answers of architecture are devoured within this really resilient utopian porn. Being right will never win against these political superbugs. It's unburdened by truth, constantly refreshed with a nonsensical set of lies, running rings around attempts at earnest reconciliation. They work the rumors and back channels with stunning success to make bulletproof forms of power. But the discrepancy gives an extra power. It inspires maybe a sly approach to spatial activism that also manipulates both sides of the split screen. The dispositions of the matrix as it is shaped by both activities and stories. So we might end up learning more from Gabriel Tarr than Karl Marx. No telos, no revolution, no consensus, but ongoing revolution. Maybe incremental waves of social contagion that are agile enough to respond to the moment when they're outmaneuvered. Is that the long con that the designer can only know how to do? So considering disposition in space making introduces into a formal repertoire the power of temporal dimension, the power of discrepancy, but I would like to suggest, yet another political capacity of the split screen or the K9 mind. If the actor says, if the actor has the line, I don't need you, while playing an action to release, I don't need you, then the tensions and the obligations are eased and violence levels are low. But if the actor plays, I don't need you, then the K9 mind knows that all the affective components of the situation are now assembling into a very tense binary, a fight with new potentials or a disposition for violence. So in the same way, potentials for violence can be imminent in arrangement, the activities, the relative potentials in matrix space. And maybe the way an organization circulates information or concentrates authority provides markers, some dynamic markers of this temperament. In the matrix space that I study, two of the many violent dispositions that are within it are repeatedly surface, the closed loop and the binary. Prizing consensus institutions strive for the steady state, from the echo chamber of corporate management ease to the self-congratulatory university or political party or the search for the right answer. And given desires for autonomy or supremacy, that closed loop often protects itself from contradiction with binary opposition, tightening its security or lashing out against an opposing challenge. It's violence through denial, consensus, expulsion, and disenfranchisement. Like the violence towards labor that circulates through the gray space of the free zones I'm showing you, or the violence towards a refugee community that threatens the boundaries of a nation. The political bullies or superbugs that we were talking about can confound dissent not only because they're masters of discrepancy, but also because they tirelessly oscillate between a loop and a binary. Sound familiar? And maybe most vulnerable, too, is the dissent that is itself a closed loop of right answers and ultimate solutions and binary tensions of enemies and innocence. There are moments when dissent must stand up and declare opposition, but as important as knowing that, knowing what to oppose, is knowing how to oppose it with a dissensus that is the opposite of consensus, sneakier techniques of activism, like a confidence game, like gifts and pandas and rumors and comedies and meaningless distractions or other totemic fictions that are powerful because of their discrepancy as well as their potentials to dissipate tensions, rewire an organization, reduce violence or concentrations of authority, or make organizations more information rich. So how can you contribute to moments of political metastasis and remission, like the moment when Welsh said to McCarthy, "Have you no decency at long last, sir?" Or the moment when Tony Curtis said, "I am Spartacus." It's something you can only know how to do, like you can only know how to hustle at pool. A slightly different set of aesthetic practices with different seductions and excesses and pleasures. And maybe some of these aesthetic practices are like English. A spin placed on the cue ball that's later transferred to another ball. English is an advanced technique with another degree of indeterminacy, because it sometimes seems as if it's less about the intention of the shooter and more about something that happens between the balls themselves. Maybe it's something like the way that, as Rancière points out, Madame Bovary or sentimental education inspired politics different from those of Flaubert himself, or maybe it's something like the way the cry of "How does it feel?" Made Rolling Stone into a counterculture anthem, even though its lyrics didn't really express those sentiments. English is an advanced technique that's not for those who like control. But then aesthetic practices like those of the hustler are successful not because they control, but because they exploit. That's what you're rehearsing. And rarely is the cue ball and its target geometrically aligned with the whole. So the majority of the shots involve expertise in indirect contact and ricochet. The player who sees only a fixed sequence will sink fewer balls and reduce the potentials of the table. It's also better not to call the shot, but to keep everyone guessing. And the constructive thing is to increase the chances for more shots, generate more information or more branches in the network of possibilities. The player who can continue to set up potentials and options can just play the table longer. It's something like being too smart to be right. Thank you.
Thank you, Keller. So one of the ways that capital operates is through systems of property that encode social proprieties and modes of governance. Helping us understand architecture's properties this morning is Catherine Ingraham, a professor in the Graduate Architecture program at Pratt Institute and a senior visiting fellow at Columbia University's Center for Urban Real Estate and Design. You probably know that in Architecture and the Burdens of Linearity and her subsequent book, Architecture, Animal, Human, Catherine theorized some of the framing assumptions of a field that she shaped deeply in her previous role as co-editor of Assemblage during the 1990s. In Contingent Excess and Charismatic Property, Catherine shares insights from her current book project on architecture, property, and the pursuit of happiness.
I forgot to put this on. So I need this as, in addition to this, or?
It's just better for recording.
Okay,
Good to go.
great. Thank you for inviting me to this conference as well. I'm very excited to learn about these, about the many incomplete and developmental sort of discourses that are underway right now. And I do think they fit together in certain ways that we will be informed by at the end of the conference. So it's an incredible thing that Mark has done to bring together this group of people, all of whom I think are saying, what exactly is my role in this? What is it I'm supposed to talk about exactly? But I currently, and I'm just putting up these images for your contemplation while I'm talking. I'll say something somewhat specifically about a few of them. I'm currently examining what happens to architecture when it hits the ground that is lawfully empowered to control seminal parts of its development. That ground is the architectural site, which is immediately or presumptively a piece of property. A great deal of scholarly work, of course, has been expended on the architectural site with good reason, but practically nothing has been written on the relation of this site, projected or real, to the property system that underlies it. And in some sense, in relation to Keller's talk, and rather than talking about the matrix, the large matrix, I'm going to talk about a fairly narrow mechanism. The concept of property in the United States, for example, conjures up many familiar associations and so forth. The relation between architects and real estate developers in particular, with a few notable exceptions, is often laden with tension because contractually architectural services rarely acknowledge the work of design. Design is regarded as an almost incalculable act. This is a paradox that has afflicted and galvanized architecture from its very beginnings. I'm speaking here chiefly about real property and real estate, Real estate and real property concern the same objects, land and buildings, but they have different attitudes toward those objects. Intellectual property is also fascinating, but in the case of architecture, underdeveloped, and underdeveloped in most cases because it's an offshoot of real property law. To date, very few architectural objects have been protected by intellectual property. Branded buildings and historically preserved buildings are so far, I think, our closest legal approximation to the recognition of an architectural building as an intellectual act, and both fall short of exhibiting the degree of engagement with law that I'm trying to set up here. I want to give the gist right away of some, maybe possibly where some of the work I'm doing might pertain to some of the subjects of this conference, which I think is wishing, I'm not sure these are the right words, to de-theorize the architectural object in order to free aesthetics conceptually from its usual passivity, to give it both political currency and what Graham Harman might call first philosophy rights. This is a very large and interesting subject, some of which is being explored by new media philosophy. I think Keller's work is absolutely exploring these matters. New work on representation as well, and narratives and initiatives that seek to articulate the spaces and discourses of the in-between. When architecture forms what I call a nexus with a property regime, which it does on a regular basis when architectural buildings are designed and constructed, an opportunity arises on both sides. From the architecture side, there is both, of course, the thrill and difficulty of materially realizing an architectural idea. The opportunity, however, lies in testing those ideas in the courtroom, so to speak, of real property, which in most modern culture oversees all spatial acts. Real property systems, whether private or public, have already territorialized other kinds of property, other kinds of space, unowned space or ecological space, a space of territorial possession that is historical or ancestral, and common space, and it's been territorialized into legal space. This nexus relationship, however, results in what amounts to an exchange of proprieties, formal and informal, between architecture and property. It's important to say that both architecture and property are abstract, speculative systems that float above the ecological ground, for example, sometimes drawing on it for resources, but not until most of its ecological expression has been cleared away or corralled. The nexus formed between architecture and property, which is an adjudication of a site system and a property system, is made possible by this shared abstract speculative rendering of the ground. However, architects do not usually have a property stake in either the building or the land. This difference of stake is exactly what estranges, to use the current nomenclature, all no doubt in an unexpected context, estranges the architecture from its property system and produces now from the property side its opportunity, which is to assay the essentially pre-legal proprieties of spatial and social relations codified in architectural work and captured in the building in a nearly completed aesthetic ordering of these relations. To restate this, architecture acts in concert with laws and regulations, but also in concert with other forces, loosely described as the realm of design and art, that are both pre-legal and legalish, a strange word that I credit John May with, showing me the potential of the ish suffix that has begun to emerge in our speech. The fruits of design are in effect given to property in this nexus, in the same way that gifts are given in a potlatch system, which is anthropological description of more non-property systems, as something that will first be given in order to oblige its recipient in some way to reciprocate. Gifts create debts, which is also to say given in order to produce a yield in value, which is registered in the building. It also has just kind of occurred to me that this legalish proprietarian economy between architecture and property might have some as yet undeveloped relationship to any number of Keller's very exciting proposals for being in and thinking about the matrix. Through this nexus, architecture potentially codifies new cultural ground for governance, which to be sure can be good or bad. And it does this through what I think of as a multivalent vestiture. It's covering and equipping of property. My description or definition of architecture as contingent excess, which I will talk about more in a minute, is tied to this vestiture, as is the emergence of what I'm currently calling charismatic property. I'm speaking here primarily of a common law setup, such as that which we inherited and altered from British property law during the formation of the United States. The main thing that we did immediately was to abolish primogeniture, the passage of property through a generational family structure, which had sustained feudal structure of land in Britain for hundreds of years. And instead, in America, we made every single piece of land, that which we already owned as colonies and that which we wanted to claim and conquer, alienable. It was able to be sold. Civil law systems, which I've not studied as closely at the moment, are top-down legal systems. The uptake of proprietary information that renders laws effective in these cultures has resulted, I think notably, if anecdotally, in far more conservative relationship to architectural innovation. The skyscraper is an obvious but complex example of the nexus I'm discussing. It could arguably have only come about in a common law system that made land completely alienable. Common law systems are based on precedent. Past legal cases are routinely called up to underwrite contemporary juridical decisions. Law thus lags behind culture. It ratifies social relations episodically and slowly. It needs specific access to cultural aggregations, such as institutions and cities, in order to formulate the contemporary meaning of postures and practices of humanity, as does architecture, which also relies on precedents and slow adaptations of spatial organizations. And yet architecture, through an excess of symbolic and material work, is also very expansive in its intellectual, historical, and spatial terms. Excess is an economic term, but also biological term that comes up in constant biological models, particularly those around property, dating back to the tragedy of the commons, among other sort of models. My main point here is to reveal in architecture aesthetics, and acknowledging that aesthetics is as yet, the scope of that word is yet to be determined. In architectural aesthetics is a juridical and thus a cultural and political dimension that is quite specific. Much of what we have attributed in architectural theory to socio-political processes have been described contextually. We examine the visual effects and manifestations, cultural processes, and histories within which architectural work is embedded and enacted, but we don't examine the formative mechanisms, the mutual and ongoing convergence of interests that literally passes through the conduit of a property system or property regime. Within this convergence also lies a series of negotiations. Architecture interrupts the smooth accrual of land value the property now routinely anticipates, which is real estate's contribution to real property, in a sense, is the discovery that the ideal building would be the building that was built literally as a bar graph with no elaboration that could not be captured by the footprint and compounded through the floor plates. Architecture almost invariably adds to land value, but not always in the direction coincident with real estate's treatment of what economists call externalities and amenities. And property interrupts and qualifies architecture's desire and claim for autonomy by bringing its proposals, good, bad, or indifferent, into the laboratory of proprieties that is codified eventually by legal systems on a daily basis. It's obvious in this drama that there are some terms that need further clarification. I am placing a heavy load on the concept of propriety, which, along with the word proper, resonates linguistically with the words property and proprietary. There's every reason for this resonance. As a number of contemporary legal scholars, one of them actually here at Yale Law School, Carol Rose, have been arguing before property was considered to be primarily about wealth, it was about propriety, propriety in action. And they also argue that this has bubbles up and emerges in contemporary property law and property relations all the time. The best example is, say, eminent domain, where federal takings of private property requires a just financial compensation. It depends on making a case for the importance of turning private property into public property. And this is, I'm thinking of Elaine Scarry's symmetry of justice, the compensatory, the necessity for compensation for this switch between the private and the public. Why should we have a public park instead of a private dwelling depends on what we think it is proper to do. As another legal scholar, Gregory Alexander, comment, just what the proper social order is has been an enormously controversial issue throughout American history. He goes on to say that a proprietarian view of property does not automatically fall on the side of, say, a desire for more public or common property. It's not ideologically marked, in other words. Many versions of proprietarian thought in American history sought to reconcile property with social proprieties that would now we would find morally repulsive, such as slavery. And proprietarian regimes are not necessarily non-market regimes, but neither are they laissez-faire regimes. To demonstrate a few things about this nexus in a well-known sort of place, referring both to the Lever House, which is here, and the Seagram building. Both of these buildings lodged the problem of the skyscraper in first, in the requirement to repeat the floor plate, which is, of course, the definition of a skyscraper, which is an economic as well as architectural response to the compounding of the value of the footprint. For developers, the value of the land, the footprint, and the footprint that's put upon it in the architectural site anticipates this act of compounding and depends on it and structures the deal in light of it. Secondly, both buildings wished to experiment with the same ground as public space. In the case of Seagram, the introduction of a public plaza at its base is well known, brought about legendary effect on New York zoning laws and subsequent skyscraper development. My point is less about the formation of this public space out of private. The POP spaces, which have been very thoroughly researched, incredibly interesting, though, the transfer of the private space that belonged to the developer to the public usage of that space and the architectural elaboration or lack of elaboration of that space. And I'm interested more, in a sense, about the precision with which a design and built architectural proposal directly accessed a system, in this case, of city governance through its property system, literally through a spatial conflation of floor plate and footprint, and the revision of the footprint to point not only vertically into the air, into the tube of property that extends up to the sky and down to the center of the earth, but also to the lateral domain of public space in the city, and thus to lateral rights. And the production of lateral rights is clearly a sort of juridical, political, but enabling a public idea of space. This convergence, in some sense, wakes property law up to its multiple relations to social ordering and its affinity with architectural experimentation. Both the Lever House and Seagram are deeply charismatic buildings, which confirms what we already know, that aesthetics is a primary carrier of social order, although it does not ensure necessarily good or desirable order. But it does address the collectivity that miraculously composes social order, which might be to say that this nexus activity activates not only the symbolic and aesthetic dimension of architecture, but also it's always already an yet elusive public character. So its public job is made clear. What is also interesting about both the Lever House and the Seagram building is that the building itself had to make room or move out of the way in order for this public space to emerge, in order for these rights to be assigned to a space. In the case of the Lever House, it was the apron. In the case of the Seagram building, it was the bustle, which extra, in a certain sense, extra structures that are attached to the tower that in some way represent or capture negotiation of cost of yielding some of that floor plate or some of that footprint to public space and concentrate it into an attachment that produces tremendous awkwardness, and particularly in case of Seagram Building, the bustle, which is not visible in this, but lies behind the building for certain kind of programmatic issues, but produces an awkwardness to the building that I feel is almost emblematic of every single piece of architecture that we can never stop discussing. The purpose of the extra something that compensates for the yielding of the building to a different form of value or rights is the way that architecture works out the problem of not being able to close itself on the site. I've been looking at a number of other instances of this nexus in the development of American architecture, but also in non-American architecture, which I haven't spent as much time on. But I think that because property systems are so intensely local, and as is true of architecture as well, that to get at it, you have to go through the highly local characteristic of those relationships. I was looking at Bogota for a while, and because it has everything, it has modernist, SOM went in the 1950s and began the trend of modernist architecture in Latin America, a complex strata system of districting and the use of tax incremental financing to develop land to introduce new social orders, following the work, and I'm following the work of this very interesting PhD student at Columbia who's been working on this problem. And in addition, there are, of course, incredibly interesting problems in the United Arab Republic. In some cases, the experimentation exhibited in some of these projects, I think, has been literally cut off from the ground by podiums that are not allowed to connect with the infrastructural system. The ground, so to speak, is off limits, and no nexus can be formed with the culture, which is exactly the purpose of those buildings, that they're meant to be there. They're meant to show the consequences and the necessity of cutting architecture off from this engagement with cultural governance systems through property systems. There are no doubt other nexi in culture formed through media platforms, for example, contribute to the formatting and formation of culture. But I think this architecture property convergence is quite unique. It's due in part to the specificity of law, but it's also due to the degenerative condition of architecture as contingent excess. I'm working, which I'm going to again elaborate shortly. I'm wondering accordingly in the midst of this conference's issues, if this nexus can also assist us in specifying our usual rather sweeping unspecified grounds for scaling from macro or micro to macro, from building to city, city to planet. Because in this nexus, in fact, is a scaling of the extreme localization of both architecture and a piece of property and its control on a site in a specific location in a town, city, or nation, each with its own idiosyncratic legal histories, up to a much larger system, and indeed to the processes of globalization, new social orders that we are striving to theorize. It's a mechanism that sustains in an instrumental way the mythos of the collectivity of social order, yet works through something like, I think, what Timothy Morton is calling ambient poetics in some way, that it's working somehow between the visible systems. I want to finish my remarks with a few more words on the genealogy of this expression of contingent excess with regard to architecture and charismatic property. I compiled both of these concepts from a number of different sources, none of which I'll be able to explain fully, but which have contributed to the pressure on those concepts. John Ruskin, for example, famously remarked that architecture is not necessary. We've heard that for a long time. Architecture designs a building through symbolic work, according to Ruskin, that grapples with material constraints but exceeds the material building. And we know that to be true. And I'm saying nothing different. Yet, as Ruskin uses that word necessary in a social political sense to suggest that architecture is sort of ancillary to culture, I think it's precisely this ambivalence and excess work that makes it absolutely necessary to culture, both for its powers of elaboration through design and also its influence over these systems that I've been talking about. A building is a necessary but not sufficient condition for architecture. In some way, Ruskin, I think, also alerted us to a problem ontologically and epistemically of finding that line between building and architecture within which this process I've been talking about resides and rides that line. Architecture as excess is architecture as symbolic intellectual work, but it's also what I would call an expansive principle, which we can see in many buildings and settlements that are not strictly architectural, such as the favelas or something where embellishment is just the first thing that happens in a way, and it's a sort of embellished urbanism. Symbolic work as excess is only meaningful in a context where meaning and value are simultaneously invested in a material object subject to assessment and appropriation. And so that's why the favelas, in a certain sense, escape the analytic problem of excess and are instead understood as an exhibition of scarcity without the other side of the equation. Once they're appropriated by the city, which everyone is trying to do, then this question of symbolic excess will enter. Is the form that the design of the inhabitation takes after the invention of property, in other words, a point in history that is extremely slippery. I say this because in non-private property systems, the notion of excess is not absent. As I said, it's sort of repressed under the idea of scarcity. But because its relation to symbolic dimension is very different. The symbolic is not made in pre-property structures to speak in the vernacular of the real, for example. The concept of excess is always troubling because it simultaneously implies in a sort of post-Marxist framework, as Bataille obviously articulated, waste, expenditure, too much, dystopias, the abject, material aggregations, congestion that we've theorized for a long time, and luxury, which now is a problem for other reasons. Contingency, on the other hand, is a sinew that can stretch but has a breaking point. Its value lies in its discrete limits, which the surrealists in particular showed us how to manage and use. Cantilevers reaching over the street violate the property envelope and entail huge masses of material support. The legal abstraction of property does not begin or end, however, with the physical boundaries it imposes. It is tied back, speaking of cantilevers, to other boundaries imposed by codes, ordinances, regulatory systems, finance, economics, systems of justice, governance, and sovereignty. Operating in the nexus between architecture and property, then, are the contingencies that belong to property law, contingencies that belong to a building, and the excess necessary to be architecture. Contingent excess begs also to be considered, of course, in light of Marx and the growth of capitalism for obvious reasons, not least the induction of terrible disparity distribution of wealth. Piketty has talked about in Capital in the 21st century, but also the manner in which excess and scarcity feed each other, exploitation of surplus value, questions of labor and autonomy, the categories of exchange value, use value, and the creation of wealth through capital rather than land. Finally, also just a few more words on charismatic property. You already know what I mean, but I want to start with a cautionary note to the effect that I do not mean simply dazzling and famous buildings such as, say, Seagram and Lever House. Although they are included, they're not they don't define the full category. Max Weber famously appropriated the idea of charisma from anthropological usage by Emil Durkheim and converted it into social constructivist concept. Weber uses the term charismatic to describe historical periods of dynamic social change led by individuals who, under certain circumstances, have the power, a temporary charisma of personality to change the structure of society. Charisma is a sociological description, but it retains elements of the enigma and mysteriousness that belong to its earlier usage in relationship to so-called primitive cultures. Charismatic leaders typically challenge the status quo in order to lead society toward a still inchoate paradigm shift. And we know who has been dangerously charismatic, and we know who has been benevolently charismatic. However, and I will have to leave things with this last statement, essentially, but I like it because it circles back, in a sense, to some of what Keller was saying. It's very important in thinking through the problem of charisma and relation, that bedazzlement that actually inaugurates this and can, under certain circumstances, inaugurate this kind of activation of this conduit through property system and other, that mechanism, how when that gets activated, that nevertheless all charismatic actions then, and that's actually the nature of, or the quieting nature of the nexus, have to settle into routines of management and bureaucracy, and that's what we despair about in certain senses, the dropping away of the charismatic figure in revolutions. But this is where the legalish makes itself known most strongly, that it attaches a managerial aspect to aesthetic elaboration. And this allows what would be otherwise simply a charismatic display of design to become a player in the articulation not only of where we live, but also what form of governance is proper to that living. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. We're going to hear from one more speaker before switching to the panel format, conducting some discussion and inviting you guys in to the conversation. Our third speaker, Timothy Morton, is Rita Shea Guffey Chair in English at Rice University. And I think that's English, the language discipline, rather than the pool technique, but perhaps we'll learn otherwise. He's the author most recently of Dark Ecology, also of Nothing, 3 Inquiries in Buddhism, of Hyperobjects, of Realist Magic, of The Ecological Thought, of Ecology with Nature, and of several other books, 14 in total, along with more than 160 essays on a wide range of topics. So through this body of work, Tim has given us compelling new ways to understand nature, ecology, objects, ontology, and much besides. He has talked planet-scale death drive with Olafur Eliasson. He's talked magic with Bjork. Now it's our turn as Tim joins us to use the force.
And I'm super, super touched to be here and really, really excited by what I'm hearing, and I just hope that I can sort of contribute to it in some way. Okay, so you wouldn't believe, this is the first sentence, I can't believe this is the first sentence of this. You wouldn't believe how many philosophers are afraid of movement. This is a really kind of moaning noise. You wouldn't believe how hard it is to explain why things keep on moving. The simple fact of what physics calls inertia. So maybe the best thing is to get rid of movement, to make it be a superficial aspect of our world, or not to exist at all. Fear of movement. I've decided to call it kinophobia because, like all phobias, it's a blocked fear of enjoyment. Enjoyment of slipping, sliding, rubbing, throbbing, licking, floating, and, horror of horrors, vibrating. Thank you for laughing. Sure, some philosophers are okay with movement. Hegel is pretty good about movement. Well, at least micro-Hegel is great about it. Micro-Hegel has this model for how things happen. Stuff sort of flops over itself like a slinky. The trouble is the flopping is only really happening in a region that Hegel calls the idea, and no prizes as to whose idea it is. White Western patriarchy. Go figure. And the other problem, the problem I call macro-Hegel, is that macro-Hegel makes the slinky move up the stairs, improbably, and at the top of the stairs, like the killer in Psycho, is waiting, drum roll, you guessed it, white Western patriarchy, in the guise of the Prussian state. So macro-Hegel blows it. Micro Hegel gives you this wonderful mechanism for movement. He makes it so that things can move by themselves, which is key. Actually, mechanism is the wrong word, because that implies things being pushed, as in Newtonian physics. The trouble is, and this is also a problem even for Micro Hegel, I sort of like Micro Hegel, is that this movement is teleological. It's going somewhere. The kind of movement I'm interested in is not only all by itself, it's also not going anywhere in particular. It's waving, undulating, vibrating. This undulation is why stuff can happen, which doesn't necessarily mean things going places. Scientists begin to see this undulation in tiny objects that are nevertheless billions of times larger than traditional vanilla quantum objects such as photons and electrons. A tiny sliver of metal, 30 microns long, close to absolute zero in a vacuum. That's what physics means by isolated, all by itself, not relating to anything else. When it's like that, you can see it shimmying. Actually, it's even more interesting than that. You can see it shimmying and not shimmying at the same time. The 0 degree of movement is not a tiny motion in space from point A, delta A, to point delta B. Minimal movement is stillness, a beautiful word. Stillness isn't static, stillness is alive. Quivering. I'm still trying to work out whether this was the right shirt to wear today. Or a tiny mirror in a lab at Caltech, thank you for laughing, in a vacuum close to absolute zero. Again, isolated. It starts to show human scientists what it's all about. It emits a bit of infrared light, a signal that it's being pushed. But it's not being pushed because it's all by itself. It's shimmering without mechanical input. This shimmering, like the light sparkling on a lake in the twilight, that's the basis of movement. It's like how listening is the basis of music, how listening is the basis of language. It's a space of attunement, of catching waves and riding them, where the question of who is influencing whom becomes very ambiguous. If I die in the next 5 minutes, put objects shimmer without mechanical input on my gravestone, please. Free will is overrated. We only don't accept this idea that shimmering is the basis of movement because we're still retweeting an old patriarchal and untenable notion of active versus passive. Do you want unsustainable paradoxes or ambiguity? I choose ambiguity every time. I reject the idea that there's a little invisible chap inside me, a command control elf, who can't actually touch any of the controls because he's made of spiritual stuff. But playing music or driving a car should clue you into something much easier to understand, but also more magical. You listen to your fellow musicians. You tune in to your instrument as you play it. You become the medium through which the metal and snaky curvature of the saxophone begin to express themselves. Human beings are not stormtroopers pacing around a universe of inert objects, manipulating them into life, nor are human beings Pac-Men who go around munching everything into existence, or as they like to say in philosophy world, negating. Human beings are trembly chameleons who love to be seduced by vibrating colors, sounds, textures. Art appreciation of any kind is a wonderfully available, even dirty, quick, and cheap way of seeing something very deep about reality. Namely, that we're caught in intersecting patterns of undulation, that this passion isn't the same as static silence. Art is a part of the universe that modern humans, obsessed with colonizing Mars and living forever, allow things to be still and quiet, not static and silent, and this is because art can still be still and quiet, vibrating. The aesthetic dimension is the causal dimension, that's why. And the underlying principle of this undulation is a complete miracle. Because things can only affect one another indirectly, because things never coincide with other things in a full-on way, and they never even coincide with themselves like that, they're not reducible to their parts, and their parts aren't reducible to the wholes that they are. A thing is an anarchist commune, whose members are fully autonomous. So because things can only affect one another indirectly, causality can't be about mechanically bonking against, but rather aesthetically seducing, pushing and pulling, spooky, non-local, like telepathy, which means passion at a distance. Things can't directly touch, but boots click against stones, guitar picks stroke amplified strings, gravity waves from distant colliding black holes make us smaller and younger, then taller and older for a tiny fraction of a second. The world is, as the esoteric tantras like to say, an illusion-like magical display. And the underlying principle, which I'm going to try to explain here, is why. Causality isn't the regular churning of complex cogwheels interrupted by miracles now and then. Causality just is miraculous, magical display interrupted by brutalist human power moves to try to make it, sorry brutalism, I actually really like the smell of concrete, you know, sort of like it. Magical display interrupted by brutalist human power moves to try to make it seem all grey and mechanical. Spinoza's also pretty good at movement and enjoyment. He argues that bodies move all by themselves, which means that a god, aka an agricultural age invisible guy who mostly wants to kill you, isn't necessary to explain how things work. You could be executed in Spinoza's day for harboring such thoughts. But Spinoza doesn't really say how it happens. It's like he shows you the airport, but he doesn't land the plane. If you land the plane, you find yourself in a realm much stranger and more miraculous than Spinoza world. There's a deep reason for why things move all by themselves and why movement is best described as vibration. It's an ontological reason, which means it has to do with the structure of how things are. In my day job, I'm an ontologist. I got into terrible trouble at this urban architecture conference 2 weeks ago for saying that. Please don't do that again. Which means I think about how things exist, if they exist. I'm not the police, so I can't tell you what exists. I have to use examples, of course, but they might not really exist. I limit myself to exploring how things exist. There might be one thing in the whole universe. That tended to be the Spinozan idea. Or there might be 2 or 500 trillion. Don't ask me. That's not what this is about. I'm here to tell you how things exist, and how they exist, as far as I'm concerned, is a miracle. It has to do with the difference between 2 things that are nevertheless deeply intertwined, appearing and being. Now, we have all kinds of prejudices about appearing and being, which mean that we usually conjure up a picture of something quite static when we hear these words. Appearing is like a painting, and paintings, we tell ourselves, are static. This obviously isn't true, not about the painting or about looking at a painting, but we keep telling ourselves that. This in itself is interesting. Perhaps we've all inherited philosophical kinophobia. Being is just sort of like sitting there like a wise old frog. Maybe being is like a sculpture. It just sits on a plinth somewhere. And the most important thing for us today is that paintings don't do things like cogwheels do. I think this is why the kind of ontologist I am, an object-oriented ontologist, comes in for criticism. It's not because of what we say, but because when people hear the word object, they see what they already think they know. And what they think they know is static and solid. You tend not to think of a liquid when you hear that word, but a liquid behaves much more like what we OOO people call an object, which could be any entity at all. When we say object, we mean just anything at all. Human, pot band, star cluster, star in a star cluster, pencil, frog, black hole, clothing on a washing line. Then you also see in the word object, as in a mirror, your worst white Western patriarchal fears about what could happen to poor little you. You could become objectified. You could become totally passive. Strangely, the fear of movement contains within it a fear of passivity, a fear of being moved, for example. Many philosophers are scared of art because it moves them like that, for no good reason, without their will. But free will is an overrated Neoplatonic Christian retweet, and if we really want to get past that, I'm afraid we're going to have to accept something like passivity quite a lot more into our theories of action. Contemporary neuroscience shows that when you intend to do something, you've already done it. This is really freaky from that Neoplatonic Christian point of view, which obviously affects all kinds of thought that claims it isn't anything to do with Neoplatonism, such as Marxism. But from my point of view, it's miraculous. It's part of the miracle I'm going to try to describe here. Stuff can happen, whether or not you intend it to happen. The ordinariness of thinking about this is a kind of ordinary magic, the best kind. The fact that stuff can happen, and there's plenty of wiggle room for new stuff to happen, as far as I'm concerned, should strike us every few seconds as something that could make us weep for joy or burst out laughing uncontrollably. Bertrand Russell denies physical action at a distance, arguing that causation can only be about contiguous things. If there's any action at a distance, he argues, then there must be some intervening entities that transmit the causality. In a wonderful passage, Russell argues thus: when there is a causal connection between 2 events that are not contiguous, there must be intermediate links in the causal chain such that each is contiguous to the next, or alternatively, such as there is a process which is continuous. Yet isn't this an elegant definition of the aesthetic dimension? Action at a distance happens all the time if causation is aesthetic. What is called consciousness is action at a distance. Indeed, we could go so far as to say that consciousness of anything is action at a distance. Empirical phenomena such as mirror neurons and entanglement bear this out. Thus, to be located in space or in time is already to have been caught in a web of relations. It isn't that objects primordially occupy some existing region of space-time, but that they're caught in the fields of and otherwise spaced and timed by other entities and by themselves. Minimally, what physics calls action at a distance is just the existence for the other of the essential qualities of any entity at all. What is called movement is simply a function of the difference between what a thing is and how it appears. How a thing appears, that's the past. My face is a map of everything that happened to my face. A flower is a plot of a genomic algorithm executing in cellulose and whatever else. A thing is an image of a cookie that crumbled in just this very specific way. What a thing is, this is the future. There is a not yetness built into the ontological structure of a thing. Readers of poems are quite good at noticing this futural quality. Who knows what this poem will mean tomorrow? Who knows how this sentence is going to end? Elephant, banana, sausage, period. Something about the poem or the sentence recedes from view, and this receding can happen because of a more fundamental, radically ontological receding that we call withdrawal in the OOO business. The sliding of the two over one another sustains a quivering, vibrating momentum, an energy, a flickering that we turn into plastic by giving it a name, present. It isn't present. It would be better to call it nowness. Time and space are nothing other than the way a thing slips and slides around itself, its appearance curling around its essence like a snake swallowing its own tail. And the way these snakes get caught up in dances with one another, the beats of which we mistake for time and space, where in fact they are the measurement of time and space. Actually, it's usually worse than that. We think we're the only snakes in town, and that we get to slither around everything else with clearly marked numbers on our scales so we can figure out exactly where everything is so we can manipulate it. The difference between what a thing is and how it appears generates an inner structural instability, a fragility exactly like the hamartia or wound of a tragic hero. This hamartia defines the style of a particular entity and the way in which its cookie is going to crumble. It's capable of crumbling all by itself. It doesn't need to be pushed by something else. Now, pushing by something else is exactly what we mean by mechanical theories of causality. The slippy, slidey quality of things, like liquid meringues, provides so much wiggle room in which different stuff can happen. New stuff can happen. There can be novelty. Rejoice! It sounds trivial that new stuff can happen, but actually, when you analyze it, it's one of the most remarkable, wonderful things about our reality ever. New stuff can happen because things aren't totally locked together, not totally capable of tracking one another perfectly, not reducible to one another. We don't live in a static lump. Revolutions and big bangs are fetishized as theistic miracles, something coming from nothing, and in the case of revolution, it's just the same old patriarchal story about some transcendental George Bush-like decider decreeing that things get underway, cutting into a continuum, let there be light. When you normalize the Big Bang for quantum theory, you find that you have lots of medium-sized bangs. Maybe we should start normalizing revolution for quivering, vibrating stillness. Maybe then we would have many more of them. Maybe they wouldn't be so scary and difficult to think about because the basic energy of revolution is just the basic energy of non-theistic miracle, of illusion-like magical display, which is the fuel of causality. Maybe the trouble with revolutions for sophisticated Marxist cool kids who seem to, please don't hurt me, who seem to have lost their way in the caring about workers' stakes is that they are too easy, too unsophisticated. Luckily, I'm not in the English department. Too unsophisticated. Just take this lead and plug it in. Let's do a gig. Maybe something will happen. Maybe not. Maybe next time. We aren't action men and we aren't pack men. And we aren't caught in terrifying prisons from which there is no escape at all. And being intelligent doesn't mean convincing you that my idea of prison is much scarier than yours. Much more fucked up. Much less easy to escape from. Since when did cynical reason take over so that the smartest person in the room is the one who says that we are the most paralyzed? There is always wiggle room, which is what's slightly too serious Buddhists call emptiness. Emptiness is how things can happen. Wiggle room comes from that fantastic lubricant, the fact that how things appear and how things are happen to be totally different, yet things are never not how they are. An apple is an apple, not reduced to bits of apple or to the fruit bowl it's sitting in. A human being is a human being, not reducible to atoms or to the economic enjoyment mode in which she or he is caught. Neoliberalism, global warming, these big bad things we care about, are physically huge but ontologically tiny. There is wiggle room. We can do this. Miracles are not the exception that proves the rule that reality is a boring assemblage of grey machinery chugging away underneath appearances. Miracles are exactly how causality as such functions. John Cage wrote, "The world is teeming. Anything can happen." Max Weber was one of the pioneers who inaugurated the discipline of sociology over a century ago, but sociology's structuring principle, it tends to exclude the foundational concept on which it's based, charisma. Weber argued that charisma-based societies give way to disenchanted, bureaucratic societies, but sociology does not see its task as related to exploring disenchantment. Sociology acts just like the bureaucratic society that Weber argues is its birthplace. Sociology is part of the logistics of what Weber called the disenchantment of the world. Sociology is afraid of its founder's concept, which was a little scary at the time too, since charisma has to do with forces that many described as supernatural or paranormal. Weber himself was fascinated by the paranormal. In general, you can think of modernity, world history since the later 1700s, as a profoundly awkward dance of including and excluding the paranormal. Freud, for instance, developed his theories as a way to Bowdlerize the theory of hypnosis, which was in turn a Bowdlerization of the idea of animal magnetism, a hypothetical force discovered by Mesmer, hence mesmerism, later in the 18th century. Animal magnetism is to all intents and purposes identical with the force of Star Wars fame. It is, as Obi-Wan Kenobi observes, an energy field that surrounds and penetrates us, and we can interact with it with healing and destructive consequences. Marx argues that capital makes tables compute value as if they were even weirder than the dancing tables of the quasi-religion of spiritualism, and so on. Examples of this secret, almost completely untold history of modernity are everywhere once you start to look. The paranormal is what religion was already excluding, religion being the way Neolithic society, otherwise known as axial age or agricultural society, agriculture, according to models such as that established in the Fertile Crescent 12,500 years ago, monopolized what Weber calls charisma, restricting it to the king who has the bat phone to God or gods whom he hears ringing in his ears, telling him to tell the people what to do, never being dismantle agricultural society, which has created patriarchy and tyranny in the name of sheer survival, and return to hunter-gathering and a less violent, less hierarchical coexistence with non-human beings. Because that would be absurd. Heaven forbid we stop the logistical functioning of the world of agriculture, which eventually gave rise to global warming, which was precisely and ironically what it was set up to evade in 10,000 BCE. That would be ridiculous primitivism, right? Restructuring or destructuring this logistics, which elsewhere I've called agri-logistics, is the one thing that would end global warming, but it's usually considered out of bounds because it implies accepting a non-modern view. The modern view is established on, although it thinks itself as a further disenchantment of, now ancient and obviously violent monotheisms, which in turn find their origin in the privatization of enchantment in the Neolithic with its civilization. We are all still Mesopotamians. We are Neolithic humans confronting the disaster of the Neolithic fantasy of smoothly functioning agricultural logistics has wrought, and we want to hold on to the philosophical underpinnings of those logistics for dear life, because otherwise, well, it's unthinkable. It's woo-woo, new age, obscurantist, neo-fascist, primitivist, insert some more kitchen sinks to throw here. The raging wall of resistance is directly proportional not to how impossible or difficult such a dismantling would be, but to rather how easy it is. It's easy because the logic underpinning Neolithic logistics is very obviously, when you study it, riddled with unsustainable paradoxes that result in cognitive, let alone social violence, in the conventional sense between humans, and ecological violence in the conventional sense regarding non-humans. It's biologically true that we aren't totally Neolithic. We have 3 million-year-old bodies infused with Neanderthal DNA and so on, but it's also philosophically and politically true. Those on the supposed other side of the fence, the so-called deep ecologists and the anarcho-primitivists, are only perpetuating agri-logistics and its devastating nature concept, the idea that humans and non-humans are profoundly different, based on needing to categorize human social space as a war against such things as weeds and pests. Such things are intrinsic to agri-logistics, the survival at any cost strategy that began in the early Holocene and that's given rise to the feedback loops we now recognize only too well via the sixth mass extinction event, namely the fact that, among other things, 50% of what biology calls animals, as opposed to fungi and viruses, for instance, have been wiped off the face of the earth in the last 50 years because of anthropogenic global warming. It's too easy to dismantle the philosophical basis of our world, aka civilization. Without this basis, that world would collapse. The only thing inhibiting us is our habitual investment in that world, visible in the resistance to wind farms. We like our energy invisible, underground, in pipes, so that we can enjoy the view. The very mention of changing our energy throughput raises the spectre of the constructedness of our so-called nature. Think of the birds the turbines will kill. Think of the entire species wiped out by not having the turbines and so forth. Think of the dreams we will be disturbing. We want to be comfy in our thanatological world. Death is comfy, as Freud observed. The 1970s ecofeminists were correct. We live in a death culture, an extinction culture. Dismantling the underpinnings of agricultural logistics involves dismantling the metaphysics of presence, the idea that to exist is to be constantly present. This idea is hardwired into Neolithic social space, aka you can feel it in the gigantic empty car parks outside the superstore, the big box houses sprawling in suburban non-place, the nihilism and murder-suicide of the mass shooters with their social Darwinist replication of neoliberal paradigms. To exist, according to this, is to be a lump of extended stuff underlying appearances. Reality is a plastic, unformatted surface waiting for us, humans, to write what we want on it. Where do you want to go today? The 90s Windows ad. Just do it. I'm the decider. That's George Bush. We create realities. Iraq War press conference 2005. There is the regular flavor of this metaphysics, basically default substance theories. We scholars all think we're superior to them, but they shape our physical life, which we happily reproduce, and we retweet them in the cooler-flavored upgrades, which speculative realism calls correlationism, which is the Kantian and post-Kantian idea that a thing isn't real until it's been formatted by subject history, human economic relations, will to power, Dasein, whatever. In a way, it's a worse, in the sense of more ecologically destructive version of the regular substance ontology. Now there aren't even blue whales. There are only blue whales when we say there are. And lo and behold, it came to pass, there were no longer any blue whales. Happily, that particular extinction didn't occur. It didn't occur because people became enchanted by recordings of whale sounds in the mid-1970s. Enchanted. What does it mean? In terms of charisma, it means some of us submitted to an energy field emitted by the sounds of the whales. The fact that this is a wholly unacceptable, beyond-the-pale way of describing it is a painful and delicious irony. But what if it were actually true? What would the emission of such an energy field imply? It would imply, for a start, that art isn't just decorative candy. It would imply what civilized philosophy from Plato on has been afraid of, the fact that, shock horror, art has an effect on me over which I'm not in control. Art is demonic. It emanates from some unseen or even unseeable beyond, in the sense that I am not in charge of it and can't quite perceive it directly in front of me, constantly present. A dangerous causative flickering. In other words, magic. Magic is taboo cause and effect, or unthinkable cause and effect, either ridiculous or dangerous or impossible, or some weird borrowed kettle combination of all three. How can something be impossible and dangerous? What are we talking about? What we're talking about here is what Einstein called spooky action at a distance, by which he meant quantum entanglement, but which also means what happens if you visualize the Rothko Chapel, even if you aren't there, even if you've never seen the Rothko Chapel per se. So perhaps even if you've never actually seen a Rothko painting or a postcard of a Rothko painting. We might conventionally argue that the charisma of the Rothko painting is bestowed upon it by humans. This would be the acceptable Hegelian way of putting it. We make the king be the king by investing in him. Investing what? Psychic energy, which, if you recall, is a Bowdlerization of the force-like animal magnetism. So this is perhaps still a bit suspect, Don't hate on me too much, grant-bestowing bodies. I really do accept that there are only plastic extension lumps out there decorated with accidents, but I'm very keen on the human meaning of things, even though I know little, like Justine in Melancholia, that this doesn't really mean anything in a vast mechanistic universe of particles. Please give me a little bit more grant money to do some more candy decoration in my depressed little self-hating corner. What if this attitude were not only self-destructive in the extreme, but also incorrect? After all, as Schrödinger already argued concerning entanglement, non-locality is the basic feature of our reality. The basic feature. The one thing you can rely on is that at the very least two tiny things, an electron and a photon, but now physicists are experimenting on scales trillions of times bigger than this with positive results, can be entangled, fullerenes they're doing, for example, such that you can do something to one of them, such as polarizing it, charging its spin, and changing its spin, and the other will, for instance, polarize in a complementary way instantly, which is to say, faster than light. And this complementary behavior happens at arbitrary distances. You can now observe two particles separated by kilometers behaving this way. One is on the other side of town, one is on board a satellite, and so on. Arbitrary means even if that particle is in another galaxy, causality just is magic. But magic is precisely what we've been trying desperately to delete. Magic implies causality and illusion, the intertwining of causality and illusion, otherwise known in Norse-derived languages as weirdness. Weird means strange of appearance, and it also means having to do with fate. Neolithic ontology wants reality not to be weird. Eventually, weirdness is confined to tarot cards and vague remarks about synchronicity. What does it mean, though, to entangle illusion and causality? What it means is that how a thing appears isn't just an accidental decorative candy on an extension lamp. Appearance as such is where causation lives. Appearance is welded inextricably to what things are, to their essence. Even welded is wrong. Appearance and essence are like two different sides of a Mobius strip, which are also the same side. A twisted loop is exactly what weird refers to, etymologically speaking. Unfortunately for the scientific ideology that dominates our world and the neoliberalism that forces us to behave in scientific ways to ourselves, one another, and other life forms, the idea that appearance is where causality lives is also just straightforward modern science. Hume's argument was precisely that when you examine things, what you can't see directly is cause and effect. All you have are data, and cause and effect are correlations of those data. So that you can't say humans cause global warming, or cigarettes cause cancer, or this bullet you're firing at point-blank range at my temple will kill me. You can say it's 97% likely that, thus opening the door to the deniers, who are in fact modernity deniers, unwilling to let go of the clunky, mechanical, visible, constantly present causality that you can point to, the sort that you have to back up with threats of extreme violence because you're a Roman Catholic Church circa 1250. Data. Things that are given, aka appearances. And Kant underwrote this devastating insight. All we have are data, not because there's nothing, but because there are things. But these things are withdrawn from how we grasp them. Kant's example, raindrops fall on your head. They're cold, wet, raindroppy. This is raindrop data, not the actual raindrops. But there are raindrops, but they are raindrops, not gumdrops. And they're raindroppy. Their appearance is entangled with exactly what they are. Things are exactly what they are, yet never as they seem. We live in a world of tricksters. We never left the pre-Neolithic. It was all a nightmare that went viral. And we know this because we have modern science. And this is the world described by object-oriented ontology, which is why OOO is so great, and the real reason why it comes in for such hostile fear and rage. According to this view, an artwork cannot be reduced to its parts or its materials, nor can it be reduced to its creator's life, nor to some other context, however defined, the last decade, the current geological era, the economic structure of human society, art discourse, power knowledge, anything. And art has an actual causal effect. Art, it just is tampering directly with cause and effect, because art is what cause and effect actually is. Art is charisma, pouring out of anything whatsoever, whether we humans consider it to be alive or sentient or not. So the task of dismantling the aura, which is the default safe self-hating mode we've been in since modernism, is impossible. What we think we hate about kitsch is its appeal, its incomprehensible charisma. How come there are so many of these Gandalf snow globes? Do people actually buy this stuff? Paradoxically, those feelings about kitsch are saying something about art. We can't control it. It's the enjoyment of the other. It's enjoyment without us. Enjoyment almost as a palpable thing, like a force field. And something about what we think about art, something not very nice. We're still Platonists at heart. But it doesn't matter. Art sprays out charismatic causality despite us. And unlike a lot of things in our current world, and within limited parameters, sophistication, taste, cost, we still let it in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Keller, Catherine, let's convene. So thanks to all three of you for your presentations. Each of them quite distinct from the other two, and yet with points of connection that maybe we can use as a starting point to draw out some of the questions of aesthetics that are surfacing in the symposium, and that will let us eventually start to bring in our patient listeners to engage in the dialogue with us. Maybe one place to start is with charisma, a theme that, Tim, you used to characterize art in a talk full, as so much of your work is, of pithy phrases that are going to stay with us and resonate or shimmer at us for some time, I suspect. So if art is charisma, charisma is also, Catherine, a characteristic of property that architecture can sometimes endow it with. Could we maybe just explore a little bit the way Weberian charisma functioned in your ways of reading art and architecture?
Can I say one tiny thing about Kant, like as a preface? So, like, okay, the third critique, right? Kant is actually fascinated by Mesmer, but also never ever writing about him, except also fascinated by Swedenborg, and then notoriously writing that very sort of dissing thing about him. It seems to me that the aesthetic experience is roughly, even in Kant, why it works, right? Why does it work, in the actual third critique? It's because roughly it's a telepathic experience with a non-human being that isn't even alive, let alone sentient. Now that's a bit weird, but Kant has to put this little tiny droplet of something like that in his theory for it to work. And remember, it works, and that therefore makes the categorical imperative work, and also makes the first critique work. So this is a very important little droplet of this force-like thing, but most of his stuff, I think you'll agree, is him going, I'm not Yoda, I'm not Yoda, I'm not Yoda. And in fact, most contemporary philosophy is just that. It's like this vast sort of Yoda denial noise.
I thought the great part about what you said about Weber was the way in which Weber, who is a founder of sociology, in fact, encounters this concept that cannot be included ultimately in sociology. And just as you say, I think that's incredible, and has to be or reorganized in a certain sense as a sort of celebration of the individual right, power of the individual, agency of the individual. To change culture and so forth, and can't descend into, culture itself, or can't be used to characterize objects or anything, anything else. So it's a very, but at the same time, though, I want to ask you, about where the managerial comes into play. Like, where is the, the charismatic-ish part? What is it that manages all this wildly, this motion? And are there micro, macro managements of movement, and or is there a kind of, or is that even a question that comes up? I mean, it seems to me that you can't just have everything shimmering. It has to be managed in order to. It has to be managed in order to.
Shimmer management.
Shimmer management.
Pimp my shimmer.
And that's always the killer, because in a way that's where all the other stuff comes from, and yet, otherwise nothing can appear to land. And landing is not all. It's not all metaphysics of presence. Some of it is metaphysics
Absolutely
of presence,
not.
and
No.
a lot of it is the the crucial sort of rejuvenation of the object through landing.
Yeah, I think
yeah.
Keller could say something to that, actually, because what I really liked about what he said was like how something like what I'm calling charisma just is a kind of management, actually, in a certain way. It's like a sort of skillful means, as they say in Sanskrit, upaya, right? And so, like, there's actually not that much of a binary between managing and charisma. Like, it would be interesting to investigate the historical sort of circumstances under which those two things became disambiguated, actually, in a certain way. Because, like, shimmering is actually, like, managing at the kind of, it's like the quantum of management is a shimmer. You could put it that way. Like the quantum of vibration is called a phonon, so maybe the quantum of managing is called shimmer.
I guess, but it's okay. I'll go with that. But I'm back to management for a second. The split, it's a lament. Actually, it's treated as a lament, in sort of a sadness that charismatic personalities drift away from the ultimate, the reinstatement of the new regime, so to speak, that they disappear because the new regime has to, in fact, produce a continuity with what came before the revolution, so that everybody before the French Revolution is still in control after the French Revolution, in the managerial sense, that the same people then are shooed back into the management role of the country, and the charismatic personality sort of skulks off into the wilderness, or something.
Perhaps also like in a sort of slightly more me trying to be mellow sense, like maybe like you don't need all full-on art all the time. Like maybe you need to have like chill spaces in your life, and maybe like the benevolent explanation for how this happens is a little bit to do with that, right? I mean, in the end, if a vibration connects successfully with you enough, it's called you get killed, right? It's like when an opera singer's voice connects beautifully with the resonant frequency of the glass goes wop, 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 and like you can see it in slow motion on YouTube, and then suddenly there's no glass, right? So like, in a way, beauty is a signal of imminent death. Like that's one reason why it's so cool. It's sort of like a tiny little homeopathic death dot in your daily porridge to like keep you alive. Do you know what I'm saying? Like if you keep eating hamburgers and trying to avoid the death, you end up dying anyway more quickly than if you eat a slightly bitter thing that's a little bit and so maybe like the freakiness of the aesthetic is actually like homeopathically very good for you, but if you increase the amplitude, it's like if you increase the amplitude, it's called the dark side of the Force. It's not evil, it's not different from the light side, and the Jedi have got it wrong. Like they deliberately have to get it wrong because that's how they explain their existence. But actually, it's just like this rather destructive to humanoid life forms amplitude of the same thing, right? So it would be like, if I was to live in the Rothko Chapel for the rest of my life, would I actually be able to do anything else?
What? I mean, I understand what you're saying. I think it's incredible. I mean, I sort of think it's brilliant how you animate actually the forces in the world, so to speak. And I think it's really, and I feel like Keller has the same incredible talent to just capture these incredible force fields, and incredibly important to the alertness and the sort of trying to the establish, the accounts are incredible. So. Yeah, I mean, I personally am allergic to sociology, but I'm sociological everything practically. But but at the same time, sort of the other narrative, you know, is there not that many choices of what the other narrative is. I mean, we always talk about these kind of political, you know, narratives and so forth, but it's very hard, as I think maybe that's what OOO is working toward, is a kind of, you know, and also in Keller's very interesting discussion of the performative, that it's a you know, it's ways of beginning to just, but every time that narrative gets very congested in a way, not in a good way, but it's, I mean, you have to answer every single philosophical position ever devised by human beings, you know? I mean, you're going way back, you know, and sort of recasting the entire history of philosophy and metaphysics, and I think that, and recasting the entire modern project, you know, project of modernity. So it's a really, you know,
It's a fun hobby.
It's been pretty interesting to me to see from the point of view of the ways we account for the emergence of modernism in architecture. There was a raft of scholarship beginning, I think, in the 1970s and building from there in books like The Spiritual in Art that recovered the extent and fundamental role of various forms of enchantment in the work of Kandinsky or Malevich or my very own Claude Bragdon, to whom Mark referred in introducing me. For me, discovering that discourses of n-dimensional space merged with concepts of the astral plane had been integral to the emergence of modernist concepts and practices of space, was a kind of revelation that preceded the entry of STS, or the work of Latour, or some of the other questions about enchantment, Tim, that you're talking about, into architectural discourse. And I feel like the role of quantum mechanics and the way dimensionality and fundamental notions of space and agency are at play in your presentation kind of brings those things together in a way that I don't know that our discipline has really worked through historically. Keller, did you want to jump in about? I am not so sure. I'm not so sure that that the kind of active form or updating platform for inflecting populations that you work on and talked about, I can't bring it together with charismatic shimmer. And I wonder what your thoughts are about whether these discourses connect up.
I think they nourish each other. I mean, I was limiting my remarks really just to the disciplinary. I mean, trying to make it possible to think about the translation of some of those ideas into the actual, you know, making of something, and especially in a time where it's quite urgent to do so, and actually seeing that you know, whether it's OOO or any number of the people that we've been talking about, or all the people who prefigure someone like Latour, you know, from ages before Latour, and any of the people who are able to kind of see an active world and look at ways to manipulate it and pull at it, and who recognize that, you know, as beings, we are filled only with sort of iterative processes and mistakes and trials and errors. It's only something about sort of horrible absolute declarations. That's the stray symptom that kind of takes us away from what we really are, which is that just shimmering, palpitating mass of stuff, and having a kind of artistic comfort with manipulating that. And I was trying to do it just at the scale of the banal, like stuff of like those free zones and things like that. Trying to figure out how to do that and do it with an artistic, think of that as an artistic, a compelling artistic practice, aesthetic practice.
I wanted to ask you a question can I ask a question of Keller the character of the videos you were showing, which were clearly composed in a way to, inform in a different way what you were saying, was also had this flickering aspect to them. So they would come on, and then they would be very short, and then and then they would close down, and then we would get another one, sort of blooming and then fading. And I was curious about whether you were choosing that kind of blooming, fading format because it spoke to the flickering or shimmering character, or whether it was meant to, it actually induced a kind of nostalgia and other kinds of reactions of sadness about the world, and sort of a sense of that the nothing could be recovered as it faded to red and brown of the being burnt in some way by the climate or whatever. So I was curious about how that's. I don't think it needs to be explained so much as just I'd like to hear your thinking about it when you're composing this.
Well, I think luckily that was a little bit of English, because I wasn't deliberately intending anything like the sort of connection to the idea of shimmering or anything like that. But I maybe was trying to excerpt this as porn, as something that's repetitive, tedious, sort of something shiny, but also something that's just kind of getting the job done. That's what I was thinking about. But I mean, the way you received it and the way it mixed in the air with what both you and Timothy were saying is English.
Yes.
I have a question for Keller, actually.
There's a mic arriving for you.
Oh, all right. So the title of the thing was English, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on like the analogy of language as it relates to indeterminacy, and the English language is interesting in relation to other languages. Like I'll be walking through Chinatown and hearing like Chinese people, and I think, oh my gosh, this is hostile conversation happening, when in reality they're just talking normally, but their language is infused with all these necessary inflections that dramatically change exactly what you're saying. Whereas like the English language itself has no requirement for inflection. And so it allows these like moments, these theatrical moments that you describe, these performances, to be like, it's just like, like, oh, I got it done, or yeah, I got it done, and so I was just curious if you had any thoughts about that, the English language as this open possibility of indeterminate theatrical experiences as it relates to these other languages, which are much more prescriptive based on, these inflections which go beyond just like the syntax. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I really meant it when I said it. It seems to me really important to sort of cultivate that canine mind that can separate words with assigned meanings from all of the other myriad cues and potentials that are associated with it. What you were, the temperaments and so on that you were receiving, even though you don't know what is the actual text of what's being said, or what the assigned words were in the case of a language you didn't know. But that ability, I often think that someone like a dog or an actor, because that's just what they do, that's what they're working with all of the time, that's just such an important skill to cultivate. And then, and as you can tell, I'm trying, and maybe it seems far-fetched, I'm trying to actually scale up that skill. I was trained in theater, so all I think I am really doing in architecture is just trying to transpose that skill to what we do, and kind of scale it up to be able to see, like literally see, kind of with half-closed eyes, yes, that I see that as a building that looks like something, or that is some arrangement of geometry, but to see from it in a split screen, just as you were on the street, see not only things that to which we give names, but their activities, their discrepancies, and their temperaments even.
May I?
Tim's going to comment,
Slightly.
and then Peggy and a couple of other.
Ever so quick then. So like English is a great example of English in a certain way, because English actually, it's not that it's better than or superior to, it's actually because it's worse than, right? Like in many ways it isn't even a language. Like I consider myself to be some kind of linguistic cripple, who can't really speak Japanese or Korean or Portuguese or all these. I embarrass myself regularly, and I justify this by the Cambridge Companion to Grammar, the newest edition of which says English doesn't have a grammar. There is no English grammar. It was all superimposed by like German people in the 18th century, right? So the point is, English is a pile of everybody else's words, right? And that's why there's no rules for like stress, right? There's no particular rules for inflection, which is why you can't have like in poetics like long and short syllables, right? But this is why you can have this kind of magical thing where you can like bend stuff and push it, because funnily enough, English isn't a language.
Peggy.
I wanted to go back to the question that Catherine, or the observation that Catherine was making about the management of the charisma or the shimmer, which does, I think, as you probably said, make things land in a certain way. And I take the relationship between what Timothy's saying and kind of what Keller is saying, as Keller is talking about the management. Keller is talking about the depth of and the complexity of that management. And so, Timothy, your response to that, which kind of collapses that management side into a more predetermined, I don't know whether we call it ontological or biological or something, either denies the importance of that management thing, I think, or depoliticizes it in some way. But I could also be mischaracterizing it to think that Keller in some way is talking about the management shiver. So I'm
we
curious.
think politics has to do with acting, and we think acting has to do with not being passive. And by thinking that way, we're actually not really being left-wing or right-wing or whatever. What we're really doing is we're retweeting a monotheistic meme that reached its apogee in Neoplatonic Christian theories of action, right? Now, the point about these theories is that they're completely wrong, and also they're not really fun, and
That's the worst part.
sort of like how you get there from here is the whole topic of this panel, right? It's sort of like three different, subtly different, yet similarly like targeted like views on how you get there, which is like how you do, like the classic thing intellectuals like to worry about. What are we supposed to do? Like at the end of the day, luckily it's not the end of the day yet, where everyone's been sitting around, and they start to beat up on themselves. We haven't been doing anything. We must get over our narcissism and do something. And I'm like, well, you just were sort of doing something there. Like, why is it wrong? Like thinking and talking and exploring and all that stuff, right? And so like how you get there, which is like politics and stuff, from here, and sort of I feel like actually it's entirely possible. In fact, I'm arguing in this book I'm doing for Verso right now that it's the only way that, for example, Marxist theory is actually going to work.
I want to just add something to triangulate between Peggy's remark and what you just said and so forth, and what Keller was saying as well. I mean, I think it's great to say that actually Keller is speaking to the management. I agree with that totally, and the doing too. But this is actually another point that you have to talk to now. But it's about how it's in a way the genealogy of object-oriented ontology. And now I'm imagining that in funny ways, the whole critique of the metaphysics of presence began with a linguistic critique, right? It began with a critique of language and how language means things. And so I know that is there. It also produced some kind of relativity, and so forth that was objectionable in a number of ways. But I'm just curious about that, about whether that's still what we're talking about at some level.
Yeah.
And the other piece to that would have to do with how object theories do induce change always, no matter what, even if you just talk about objects in a new way, that it's massively consequential down the line. And how it goes down the line, I think, is always surprising and sort of wild.
So like one tiny thing, maybe tiny, like, I'm originally a literature scholar trained in deconstruction, yeah? And actually deconstruction is coming from Heidegger, which is more about like spanners and stuff and like having projects like making buildings and stuff than it is about strictly like very narrowly defined language per se. Though I take your point because the way that entered into, right, and the point is that entered into my world through Derrida, right?
Yeah.
And so like, I'm unhampered by the way in which I kind of backed into OOO through deconstruction. I actually don't perform this kind of let's kick the linguistic turn in the nuts thing that some people think they might have to do because I'm lucky. I'm just very lucky because of my education, yeah? And so I feel like it's totally kind of like blended. There's no real obstacle there. Not really, but I'll shut up because like I'm trying to listen and like understand more like what you're saying and all that.
The question in row 6 and then in row 2.
Yeah, thank you. I would just, before I ask my question, like to shortly say that I'm doing a PhD in architecture with a psychological background. So my question also has a lot of people interest in it. And I've also worked with Olafur Eliasson a lot, and that also has a lot of people in it. So what I've heard in all of your lectures was a focus on the in-between and on the formative process, which I think ties quite well with that, and on movement, which also ties well with that. But what I see as present in all of these things are, especially in relation to architecture, are people and users who experience and perceive aesthetics building space. And I see this as them being part of this formative process of aesthetics, of course, also of movement, and on the indeterminacy. So I think my question is both to you, because neither of you mentioned users or people, or I would say any relation to psychology, for example, or thinkers such as James Gibson, ecological psychology. So a question into that, and perhaps because I work with design in architecture, I find that ties very well with the practice of architecture, and I think integrating psychological thought into the design process might tie your talks to the practice of architecture. So, yeah, your comments on that, I think.
I think I accidentally used the word affordances in there with reference to Gibson. And I'm out of my depth in talking about psychology, but I mean, I suppose, and this gets back to the question of management too, that the things that I am observing just in the ephemera of global politics are deeply psychologized attempts to make even things. I mean, I can use the word management to mean attempts to organize and make salient, but I can also use the word management in terms of ephemeral management culture, business culture, and it's amazing to me and quite beautiful to me that that management culture, in its attempts to make order and saliency, becomes sort of beautifully absurd set of completely comedic aphorisms and bullet-pointed lists and executive summaries and guidelines with gurus and self-help motivational scripting and so on. So it almost creates a kind of control error. It explodes itself as it tries to control. But it all comes from, a lot of the jargon is from, Lewin and other behaviorists, and that we're mixing with management culture in the mid-century.
May I say something to that? Yes, great, sounds fantastic. In fact, I'm going to agree with you even more than you agree with yourself. And here's why, which is my two-word Clinton impersonation. As long as people means any life form whatsoever, I'm totally down with what you said, because the users of the building, it's all about the users, and some of the users are frogs, right? Some of the users are bacteria. Some of the users are things that we like to vector out of the building as quickly as possible with air conditioning.
Motes of dust.
Right, exactly, right? And so there's a whole psychology and psychic dynamics of that, actually. It's not just like the psychology is confined to this one little region called the human being, in fact, right? And so sort of very much that was what I was saying. So I agree with you 160%.
This is the panpsychic. Is that correct?
Why not?
I thought that was the French version of OOO.
Why not?
The panpsychism.
Yeah, why not?
That'll be.
Two.
Yeah, why not? I agree.
And you never know, right? You never know even if you have a mind, so why not let other people have them? Why not?
Right. Why not?
No, right behind.
Thank you. I have a question to Keller. I like very much the way you shifted our attention from the object, from the thing, to the propensity of things, and then aesthetics becomes something much more interesting for us. It's not just related to the object, to the beauty of the object, but to the indeterminate patterns of the propensity of things. And I wonder whether there is a hidden notion of politics there, maybe to connect it with the topic of activism and aesthetic activism. Aren't you also trying to shift our attention towards a different notion of politics? Not politics with big P, related to ideologies and institutions, not politics related to big powerful men and the human subject, but politics that is generated by the propensity of things. That is the politics that architecture is capable in generating through performance, through the shivering of the whole dispositif, through the disposition and all this force that emerges out of disposition. And I think probably you have the French philosopher François Julien behind the concept of the propensity of things and disposition of things. But again, to relate it to a certain form of politics with small p, we need to shift the attention, the whole question of politics and aesthetics, from the question of who acts, a politician or an architect, towards the question of what acts and how it acts. And I think it's a wonderful argument. So if you want to develop this a bit more in connection to the very notion of aesthetic activism.
That's a wonderful question. Well, I was very careful not to use the word object, but and to just kind of bring it into my discipline and talk about sort of. Although I use the word thing, which also can be a tricky word to use, but I am trying to say, just as you suggest, that that if there are, in the split screen, if there are qualities that space has, if there are capacities, dispositions, potentials, so on, just in the arrangement and relationships between things, if those can be undeclared, can they be part of a sneakier political set of moves? And you know, when you see something like the free zone being used as a kind of secret weapon of some of the most powerful people on Earth, then you think, well, you know, two can play at that game, and many of the things that can remain undeclared, not written on the placard, not said at the barricades, but something that can soften up the ground for a more declarative dissent, but something that is more like a dissensus, that is often undeclared, and can then be more sly, to play tricks. And then at the end I was trying to suggest, can it not only play tricks, but can it, and I'm just asking the question, can it even make shifts that reduce violence and tension in organizations? Sometimes the violence and tension that dissent that's like this exacerbates.
Yeah.
But the answer has been, at least generally speaking, is I think all three of us are sort of imagining this thing called art that is capable of that sort of softening up and use of, and sort of, you know, a completely alternative way of entering the problem. And how I mean, in my case, I'm interested in the way that pairs with sort of legal curiosity about how order should be established. That I think that there's that's actually problematic in a way, the way in which art is being asked to contain, as always, in a certain sense, this sort of ability to sort of perform the, you know, what every other bureaucratic and sort of human endeavor seeks to undo, and then art sort of comes in in its beautiful way, you know. And
It strikes me that one of the
I
differences...
mean, I believe it, but
And
there's
Keller,
a problem of romanticism. Yeah.
I don't know if this makes sense to you, but it seems to me that
Maybe that's okay.
one of the differences, maybe, Catherine, between what you just said about art and the work that I imagined when Keller was talking is that she seems to be focusing on architecture that materially instantiates a lot of these systems, and that it's often operating in a different register than we're used to recognizing as its artistic register.
Oh no, I know. But I was thinking of the performer as the artist in the case. That what the performer is the artist, and that is performing at the edge of the architecture, in the zone of the free zone of the commerce. That the performer then comes and links together a new set of a chain of command, or something that is able to begin to undermine it, or something. But you could say also, under certain circumstances, there could be an architectural performance that was tapping into that same kind of power. But I don't know. I mean, when we look to art in that way, we forget that. Do we forget, I guess would be my question, that there is, that it's not a separate category of being, so to speak, I mean, right?
Well,
it's still inscribed by everything you say about, you know, the human appearance and being.
Well, as you were talking, I kept thinking about it, about the way in which you see now, and this may be too explicit, if so, I apologize, but you know, one sees now almost a new kind of land art, you know, where a practitioner is working on kind of slyly pulling at certain kinds of legal threads and property threads to have effects that you can only kind of see in time lapse, in another kind of almost cinematic artistic practice and it's not, and it can be, you know, quite thrilling. Whereas, you that in our discipline would have been relegated to some kind of,
Right, crazies.
banal practice, whereas it's actually quite thrilling.
Yeah.
I think Mark was going to jump in, and then we have a question from row 2.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I'm going to try to make a link, but that you guys might hate. But it seemed, Keller, you were talking about, for me, this kind of distance, this separation between the words of what someone says and the means in which they say it. Like they're related in some ways, but they're not the same, right? And it seemed that Timothy was making a case for there being a true reality to a thing, and then the realm of appearances, which kind of affect, which are emitted by it at a distance. That there's this distance in both of your discourses between the kind of real thing and the appearance of the thing. And it seems to me that architecture is very much invested in the first, in the truth, in showing the tectonic connections, in showing the program, in showing how it's environmentally sustainable. That architecture has this invested history and interest in the truth of the thing, in the words that are said, in the reality of what humans need. And it seems to me that both of you are kind of in different ways talking about the weaponization of the appearance layer. That maybe it's not about the pursuit of like the absolute truth, but a sneakier way to think about how architecture can be made political is like war by other means. That instead of trying to combat the world of excessive lies and the dominance of the confidence man with just more truth, that there's a different unclaimed territories, like Keller is mentioning in political terms, or maybe you're mentioning in ontological terms, that are untapped as modes of practice.
Yeah, can
And I wondered if that would be like offensive that I said that
If I
to
may,
both of you.
yeah, like, okay, so part of what you said, yes, and another part, no, actually, because the idea that there's a distance between being and appearing, it just is Western metaphysics, which I am trying to deconstruct using the movement OOO, right? The idea that you can peel appearance away from being just is Western metaphysics. The idea that acting is different from appearing, and that political acting is different from art, which is sort of like the point of this whole conference, plus the, like, it's the motivation, it's that it's like a bad thing, right? So it's not necessarily just about being sneaky. It literally means, like, when a crane is lifting a gigantic object high up in the air, that's all happening in the appearance realm, actually. You know, it's nothing to do with, like, super subtle things that you can only really detect with, like, super psychic subtle people or very super psychic subtle detectors. It has to do with the fact that, as some of the Caltech people now say, there is no classical world, right? Like, this idea that mechanical causality happens at all is incorrect, right? Like, that's just like a good enough human anthropocentrically scaled, like, fuzzy picture of what's actually happening. But, like, everything about that crane lifting that thing is nothing to do with mechanism, actually, right? And so therefore also political action, actually nothing to do with it. And one way in which we've been hampering ourselves is precisely this problem. And many, many people think that, right? Like, many people have tried since Kant, you know, I don't know, Schiller, Adorno, just take your pick. Like, can we smush these two things together, right, in different ways, right? And it's like, what if they never, ever were separated, ever, right? But the paradox is there is a difference between what a thing is and how it appears, right? The paradox is that there is, on the one hand, things are what they are, and on the other hand, they're never as they seem, right? So in order to be in my world, you have to accept one thing at least being contradictory. You have to accept a logic that can allow things to be P and not P at the same time. They can be things, and these things appear, and the appearing is different from, and yet exactly the same as, at the same time as the being, right? Section gamma of Aristotle's metaphysics never proves why the law of non-contradiction is a rule. It's just like a rule that we've not only accepted in philosophy, Western, but hardwired even before Aristotle into social space, right? Like, the big problem is Humans over here, non-humans over there. You know, contradictory to human things over there, human things over here. Human things, oh, well, maybe we need like cattle, you know, like women and stuff under patriarchy and like various prosthetic devices that'll enable us to manipulate things better. But basically, this is the human world and that's the non-human one. Here's our thin, rigid boundary between the two. It's called a city-state, you know. Oh my God, there's now a miasma. But, oh dear, we must be responsible for the Oedipus, you know. Oh, stab me eyes out, you know. Like, the original hyperobject perceived by humans is like the kind of the plague or miasma thing that these city-states thing are creating through this very rigid division, not just like in social space, but in philosophy space and psychic space, right? And so the point is actually noticing that they weren't ever separated. You know, like figuring out like how we got into the problem in the first place is also interesting kind of thing, because it mustn't involve a full narrative, because full narratives are axial age explanations of themselves and therefore can't actually really genuinely explain stuff. So it's not as if all of a sudden we were all cool and funky and wonderful, and then all of a sudden we became corrupted and bad and evil. How on earth do you actually get there from here, in fact, funnily enough? The fact is that we're still in, you know, and this is where people say, oh, Tim, you're appropriating indigenous cultures, because there's this very strong correlationist idea that cultures are totally separated. But the trouble is that it depends upon a concept of world that is like really untenable and actually nothing to do with Heidegger, even though Heidegger himself kind of like was freaked out by his own idea and had to become a Nazi to like to defend himself against it a little bit. So sort of like worlds are perforated and can interpenetrate is the point. And sort of like there's much less of a problem we think. I'm going to say something very, very wrong now that you're not supposed to say. I always say the wrong thing. Like I'm always like the devil in any kind of academic or social situation. For some reason, there's this kind of scapegoat wanted sign, right? And I'm the one, like Donkey, who's like, pick me, I'll say that bad thing. And so the bad thing I'm going to say now is that we're still in the dream time. We never left.
And yet many, I want to ask you, I don't know if this makes any sense. I just want to say, does it mean that a claimless condition, you could say, that doesn't lay claim, and all claims that are laid are bad claims in a way, in the sense that they have distorted this condition? I'm trying to think of claim in this artistic term of like laying claim to a certain kind of point of view or a certain kind of form of governance or a certain kind of
No, that's cool.
whatever false, you know, business management, whatever. All of these are some.
Everything like, I think maybe a slight difference between me and Keller, but maybe not. Because I was taking really careful notes and wondering what you meant by indeterminacy might be a little bit not what I mean by it. But like, for me, my idea of indeterminacy, you know, I don't like that concept. I prefer ambiguity. I prefer the fact that like everything is super specifically exactly what it is, but that this fundamental hesitation precisely as a condition of possibility for the existing, an accuracy and like definition of that thing, right? And I take this from nothing really special, but mostly from the eye doctor. Like when you go to the optician, you know, and you get down, and they always get down to this point where it's like, is it number one or number two? And you're like, oh my God, I can't decide anymore. This one is slightly like tweaking my vision this way, and this one's tweaking my vision this way, and they're both equally good. Oh, I don't know, I'll go with option one, right? That ambiguity is a signal of an accurate prescription, right? And I think that means that ambiguity is a signal of like how reality actually is, yeah? Go from the opticians to the ontologist's office quite quickly there, and sort of like how, like, instead of allowing things to be vague and fuzzy, well, not fuzzy, but like how allowing things to be like soupy or kind of cloudy, you can actually allow things to be extremely high definition and totally ambiguous at the same time. Precisely that high definition and the ambiguity don't necessarily cancel each other out.
And
so
cooperation doesn't change that.
We're
Is that
always
right?
making claims.
Sort
right?
of affiliative relationships
we're always
doesn't
making
change that?
Yeah, claims are fine, right? Like you know, like not just with your voice and your brain, but with like your hands as you put the toothpaste on the toothbrush. And like, for example, as far as I'm concerned, because I study Buddhism, Buddha can use the toilet. It's like she's not disabled from being able to brush her teeth. She can make jokes, go to the restaurant, drive a car. Just because like she's got this enlightenment doesn't mean she can't like do stuff in the world. Do you see what do you understand what I'm saying?
Can I just follow for one more second? I wasn't thinking of not doing. I wasn't worried about that. I'm not worried about what you do or whatever, but I'm worried about, I'm not sure, well, I mean, I think implicit in that, I guess you would say, is the way in which independent entities bond with each other. And how does, or does that matter? I mean, is that not because you could say it's the bonding of societies, let's say, or something, that then produce these, aggregations
it's the
of whatever.
That matters, right? It's the only thing that matters. It's basically like when you brush your teeth, you make a little tiny, political formation
political
there.
formation.
Some toothpaste and a
Right.
toothbrush and a sink
Right.
and a mirror and you.
Right.
And that lasts for like 5 minutes.
But it's
whatever.
that impulse toward that, actually, that produces the fallacies that you're remarking on, and the failures of every theory of whatever and so forth. I mean, right? So to some degree.
I think Keller said something really good about like how management can kind of like co-emergently get itself really wrong in the very process of trying to get itself right. And I feel like that's the real problem, is that getting it wrong is like co-emergent with getting it right.
Right.
You can't really peel those two away, you know, and so you have to kind of figure out how to operate now that you know that like blowing it and like really like succeeding and having the mojo are simultaneous with one another, co-emergent.
Yeah, I think the two indeterminacies that you were hearing are not incompatible, but they maybe are just a little bit different. The way that word has been used in certain discourses about aesthetics or socio-technical networks, and I was trying to bring it into a usage compatible with the ways that all three of us use it, but to simply talk about to argue for a comfort with indeterminacy as something that is, it sounds contradictory, but more practical, more really about the way things operate, and as a very unlikely counter to a world that looks to master plans and global standards and declarations. So to say that indeterminacy isn't, the indeterminacy is often really just about the release of a certain kind of practice or knowledge into time. That's it's indeterminate on that scale of working.
I know we have at least one more audience comment or question.
Well, my question, I think, was related to some of the issues that you've already mentioned here, but it was an idea that came up from Keller as early as your discussion of issues of indeterminacy and English. And for me, the metaphor, even more so than English, which I think top pool players can really control, is the break. I mean, that's a moment of real indeterminacy. And one of the problems with the break, and maybe top pool players can control this too, but is the cue ball can go into a hole, and then you're done, right? So as I'm really intrigued by all of the discussions here around contingency, around the emergence of the new, but if it truly is new, sometimes the outcomes are bad outcomes. And maybe that links back to some of the comments that were made about politics. To me, one of the risks, I think it's a risk worth investigating, is that if you're going to accept indeterminacy over rational planning, then you have to accept that just knowing how to do it probably has to go out the window too, because you don't know the answer. And if you really don't know the answer, sometimes it's going to go wrong. Well, and I wonder, and you had just suggested earlier that, going wrong and going right actually work, co-parallel with each other. I wonder, though, about whether or not the emergence of the new really does work out so felicitously as you described.
So, like, one way of talking about it would be to explore whether you can, like, slightly know the answer. Like, can you 70% be right or 20%? Like, in my view, like, truth is modal. Like, you can be, like, 90% correct, right? Like, 20% right. Half good, it's almost there. this kind of analog region between being completely wrong and right is implied in what I'm arguing, actually. And so there's less of a problem. It's sort of like, on an ethical scale, you can have some solidarity with the lion. Just look at the Cecil the Lion episode of last year, right? It only goes up to there. It doesn't go up to there, but it doesn't go, it's not at 0. It's at like that %. But that's all you've got anyway with yourself, because your whole world is kind of perforated like that, and you don't really know, you're not really fully in charge of yourself either, and you're not really yourself completely either, like the way a stick of Brighton rock says, you know, like, this is a Tim Morton hand, this is a Tim Morton shirt, this is a Tim Morton sentence by Tim Morton, you know, like, that's what you can't do, kind of thing. And so sort of like, that doesn't imply anything normative. And I'm not sure Keller's saying that indeterminacy is normative. It's like, it's not like, oh, we have to choose between being indeterminate and being like totally planned and everything. It's not that in particular. And the trouble is that it could easily be misheard as that, right? Because we want our views of the world, roughly, ontologies, to come bundled with some easy to identify politics or ethics so we can relax. Oh, thank God it's left wing. Oh, God, thank God, right? And the point about this region that we're talking about is, it's highly ambiguous, and you can't put a label on it very quickly, not the labels that we've got anyway right now, and like, it keeps being deleted by the kind of talk that like wants to figure out, well, exactly though, how does it work based on my prefabricated idea of the word work, right? You see what I'm saying? So sort of like, it gets irradiated by these kind of gamma rays that we emit from our own institutional positioning in kind of whatever this is, neoliberal, whatever history, yeah? It's the kind of cultural determinacy of that, right? And so sort of like, speaking in this way is a little bit like, it's going to sound silly, but then again, I feel like, how come silliness is not a political category? Like, how come all politicians, the one thing they shouldn't be is silly? Like, the most effective politician I know is my friend Jon Gunnar, who was the mayor of Reykjavik. He's a stand-up comedian who used silliness as a political tactic to achieve some kind of wiggle room in order to get stuff done, right? And so sort of like, somehow that's what we're all saying in a way. It's sort of like, how come being a bit playful and silly isn't acceptable in modern politics space? That's a bit, like, if someone from Mars, like indigenous person from Mars, came to look at us being all serious and, oh, what are we doing and all that stuff, they'd assume that we were playing because we really do it all the time, and therefore we seem to like it.
Yeah, it is funny that when even hearing the word indeterminate makes us think that means without intention or not deliberate or something like that. So, but
that wasn't. I meant that the outcome is unknown to some extent, unknown.
Yeah.
Right? No, that's not what indeterminate means.
Right, but it seems that the pool playing is actually not a bad little model because being right about something is so much weaker and so much more friable because it only lasts for an instant, until you're outsmarted by, until the cheaters figure out how to cheat you back, So if you're really gonna play cool, if you're really gonna stay in the game longer, then you only know, kind of a few things about what might be coming next. And you can make deliberate shots, but it's not, it's much sturdier or more resilient to be able to change, to be able to play with what's latent in situations and undeclared. And
we invite a last comment or question before we break for lunch. Yes, sir.
I was really interested in the metaphor of the con and the long con and what that admits, especially set next to Catherine's points about power and how it accrues to those who are able to position themselves inside of the kind of ordained structures of ownership and to harness the words of this election cycle, put those rules to work for them. And I wanted to ask to the both of you, there's been a kind of a moment for architects in the wake of the Atlantic City debacle, that the architect who went unpaid for his services in that was actually brought to the debates as a kind of damning piece of evidence that the architect was in that moment of political theater the sucker. And I wonder, Keller, if the images that you show of architects kind of complicit in making these spaces is also a different kind of condemnation or just demonstration that architects can be suckers. And then starting from there, rather than from an abstracted point where an architect is neither sucker nor hustler, how does your language of the long con start to work? Is there maybe a way in which this kind of period of complicity turns into the first component of a very long con? But how do we evaluate kind of our present situation as a profession, say? And how do we kind of locate ourselves at the outset of what could turn into such a maneuver?
Well, I mean, it seems to me we have a massive repertoire to be a con artist, completely underexploited. Not only are we correlative thinkers, but all kinds of levels of organization and potential, and probably could be good pool players in that world, but could also be using non-spatial instruments and fictions with the deliberate intent to have spatial outcome, to have spatial consequence, to work with fiction and comedy as an actual spatial tool, like to make, like if I told you that all those were counterfeit and I just made them up, or I was trying to make another story in this world that I'm looking at. One story can be incredibly contagious. If one free zone has color-D fountains, then all of them have to have color-D fountains. So what could an architect do to figure out what the next contagious story is that races through this population of repeatable things with a very deliberate idea about the potentials for a spatial consequence, until the cheaters figure out how to cheat you back.
Yeah, I did. I don't know if I don't have a better answer than that, and probably I think it also is an incredible repertoire of possibilities. But it's partly because we forget what we deal in. We forget what we're dealing with. We forget. We think that we're we get all wrapped up in a sort of not uninteresting and sometimes extremely deep and powerful sort of formal acts that we forget what it means to do that, what the consequences are, and what the implications are, and what's the how do they go deep, and how do they rise to the surface, and so forth. So I think that it's partly that we've lost a sort of insight into our own discipline to some degree, and the rich, all the rich array of potentials for both, for the raising of the question in a certain sense, even of the whole range of questions raised at a conference like this. So that we are actually in that domain of, the domain of those questions. So, and how we speak of them, and whether we keep our usual disciplinary kind of reserve, which is to say, oh, that doesn't count as architecture, or that doesn't count as an architectural conversation, and it is deadly. It's a sort of plus our inevitable self-flattery, which is just to keep us from dying. Is what we're thinking. We're a threatened species, and we feel like if we don't flatter everything we are and do, we will be we'll be wiped off the face of the earth, and it's possible. So I think there's a real so in a way there's attentiveness and alertness, but also kind of this inner force of you know, sort of, what's it called, insularity or whatever. And it's part of what's, yeah.
Please join me in thanking our three presenters.